Politics has changed a lot in the time that I've been here. When I first became interested in politics, this was in the 1980s, I kind of caught the Reagan bug. You know, here was Reagan, and he was a very whimsical, almost implausible man to be running for president. And yet he was making very large claims about the world and challenging the big idea of the 20th century. The big idea of the 20th century, collectivism. We had a Soviet empire abroad, you had an expanding welfare state at home. And so Reagan was challenging all this, and I was very intrigued by this as a young freshman in college. And I kind of became a Reaganite, but the way I looked at American politics at that time was that American politics is an argument between two groups of people who want to go to the same place. In other words, in American politics, we agree on the goal, but we disagree about the means. After all, everybody wants America to be strong. Everybody wants America to be prosperous. Everybody wants to live not only in the free society, but in the decent society. We need a measure of law and order. We also need a society which acknowledges an external code of morality. We agree on this. Where we disagree is about some of the techniques of getting from here to there. I think one of the remarkable things I've realized in the intervening generation, the last 25 years, is that this common understanding of American politics has broken down. One group wants to go to Maine, and the other group wants to go to Chicago. And this renders obsolete all the well-meaning people who say things like, I just wish the two sides would sit down and have a lengthy conversation and work out their differences and come. You can do that if you're going to the same place. But if you're two sides of a tug of war, both pulling on the rope and each one trying to go in an opposite direction, that kind of dialogue becomes a little bit pointless. I think if we think of guys like Obama and Hillary, they are in some fundamental way different than the Democrats who came before. They're different than Dukakis. They're different than Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, if I can be kind of honest about it, a well-meaning nincompoop. Now, when we think back to American history, America is a country that has been formed out of three core principles. The first one is the idea of economic freedom. And economic freedom is not some bizarre Adam Smithian theory. Abraham Lincoln put it really well. The simple idea is that the hand that grows the corn should be able to put the corn into its own mouth. In other words, we should generally get to keep the fruits of our labor. And Lincoln, in fact, defined slavery in terms of the principle, you work, I eat. So slavery is the idea that one guy raises the corn and another guy eats it. The theft of another man's labor is the essence of slavery. And so economic freedom. The second type of freedom is political freedom, and that simply means is participation in democratic self-government. And the third is civic freedom, civil rights, human rights, the ability to practice our own faith, to speak our own mind, personal freedom, you might say. So these are these three types of freedom, 1, 2, and 3, economic freedom, political freedom, let's call it civic or civil freedom. But there is one type of freedom that the American founders did not endorse. It's the missing type of freedom. And I say that because today that type of freedom is at the forefront. The American founders believed that there is a moral order in the universe that is external to us, that makes claims on us. This moral order can be represented by the Ten Commandments or by any comparable moral code. And it's important to realize that in American history, until very recently, this was completely uncontroversial. You didn't have to go, even if someone was not a Christian or Jewish or not a believer at all, and you said, hey, the Ten Commandments is a good way to live. Most people would go, well, yeah, obviously. It was not something to be fought over. And so, this is not to say that everybody lived up to the code. But the code supplied an unwavering standard. Everyone acknowledged its existence, and our job was to kind of try our best to raise our standard to the moral code. Now, I say this because to me the biggest difference I've seen in America from the way it used to be to now is that we have seen in America the emergence of a new type of freedom. I'm going to call it moral freedom. Moral freedom. And moral freedom is not, as some people would say, a complete rejection of morality, i.e., I don't believe in morality. Being human, we can't get rid of morality. In fact, if somebody truly gets rid of morality, if they can't tell the difference between right and wrong, they become a psychopath. In a certain sense, they're not even a member of the human, adult, morally responsible species. So, what has happened in America isn't that people reject morality. They have essentially, and this is true of young people, they have relocated morality from out there to in here. In other words, what we have seen is a great shift in the source of morality. From the external code to what I'm going to call the inner self. The inner self. And this inner self becomes the referee and the arbiter of morality. This started in the 1960s. It was mainly found in bohemian areas of America, but now it's very widespread in the culture. And it makes the so-called social issues in American politics very difficult to fight. Why? Because ultimately, the social issues do not come down to, is this right and wrong? The idea of right and wrong implies some existing external code. It comes really down to how each person feels about it. And your inner self gets to trump any external claim of morality. Now, all of this may sound a little abstract, and it's important to realize that these ideas are not taught as philosophical nostrums. They are actually fought out in the culture, and the political left, which is a very secular left. I'm always amused by people who try to say Obama is a Muslim. I mean, this seems to be a guy with no religious bone in his body. I don't know if you agree, but I think here's a guy who sees the world in a secular, fundamentally secular way. And the secular left in this country has been aggressively promoting moral freedom using its three big megaphones. Its three big megaphones are academia, Hollywood, and the media. Now, those are perhaps the three biggest megaphones of our culture, and they can put out a whole lot of information, they can put out a whole lot of disinformation, they can put out a whole lot of propaganda, but remember that by and large these megaphones are operating uncontested. If you think of something like the gay marriage debate, the gay marriage debate didn't begin when there were referendums in California about gay marriage. The gay marriage debate began when Ellen came out of the closet, and 200 sitcoms and all these movies. And so, in other words, the left has been fighting this culture war using its big megaphones with no rival megaphones on the other side. Think of something like the great influence in our culture today of comedy. The left has Colbert. They have Bill Maher. They have Jon Stewart. We have, well, basically nobody, nobody, and nobody. And not only do young people get their sense of what is hip, what is cool, but they also get their information about politics from these guys. So many times as parents, as grandparents, we are a little surprised to see our own young people wandering away from the values in which we tried to raise them. Not only their political values, but also their religious values. Off to college, we're often the actual instruments of paying the bills of the people who are actively subverting within our children's own hearts our values. So this is a little bit of the predicament that we face in America today. And conservatism and Christianity are not the same thing. They're two separate things. But they are both under the same they are both facing the same kind of problems in the culture. The position of the conservatives and the Christians is the weakest. If you look, for example, at a typical college campus, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, or my own alma mater, Dartmouth, probably the worst thing to be if you are a professor in those colleges is a conservative. Probably the one unspeakable thing to do in politics right now would be to say a good word about Trump. On the other hand, if there is one thing that is even worse than that, it would be to be a public, acknowledged, outspoken Christian. That would be seen as even more out there. We have essentially seen not only a massive expansion of the centralized state, the government, but we've actually seen the government do something quite new in the last 8 years that it didn't do before, and that is essentially colonize large sectors of the private sector. In other words, if you look at something like Obamacare, the big thing about Obamacare is the government now controls 1/6 of the U.S. economy. And when we say the government, we don't mean the government, we mean the progressives. It's a bunch of guys who control the government, and they tell the doctors what to do, they tell the hospitals what to do. Not only is it true that we are living in a country where Christian assumptions can no longer be taken for granted, not only are we living in a country in which the external moral code has broken down as a consensus of the society, but we suddenly find that even the simple job of going about our ordinary business unmolested is becoming increasingly difficult. In other words, what if you said, look, we've lost the country, let it go. All we want to do is live our own life and leave us alone. All we want to do is be able to go to school and go to work and look after our kids and teach them our values. And all we want to do is go to church and worship as we will. And we suddenly have this rather uncomfortable feeling that even if we were to surrender in that way, they wouldn't be content with that. They wouldn't let us do that. Their goal is actually to come after us and pursue us into our homes and into our churches and make sure that we conform with their guidelines and their requirements. Otherwise, they're going to make life extremely difficult for us. And they have very powerful ways of doing that. There is today we live under a federal criminal code that is so expansive that literally the federal government can run its finger through this audience and pick out anyone and decide to charge them with a series of federal crimes, felonies, that added together would put this adult individual away for at least 10 years. And they can do that to you now based upon nothing that you are about to do or any crime that you may have contemplated, just based upon what you have already done so far. And the reason is our federal statutes are so accordion-like that they are amenable to making these kinds of accusations. And before I came up to the podium, I was talking to someone who is a family care practitioner. All right? So here's the charge. Illegally prescribing pain care medicine. Now, obviously the doctor prescribes pain care medicine to reduce pain. But there are federal laws that talk about giving pain medicine to people who don't really need it. And so right away they go to the doctor and say, we're going to charge you with illegally prescribing pain care medicine The penalty is the permanent forfeiture of your medical license, up to 5 years in prison. But if you plead guilty, we will have you pay a fine of $100,000. We will give you 6 months, and we will not forfeit your license. In other words, what the government has is the power to blackmail you or to bludgeon you using the plea bargain system. Either you risk destroying your whole life and never being able to practice your profession again, or whether you're innocent or guilty, you plead guilty. And then we have you under our thumb at that point. The criminal law itself becomes a mechanism to reduce you to subservience. This is not the Soviet Union where they send you off to the gulag. But Alexis de Tocqueville foresaw this. He called it soft despotism. It's a softer form of despotism because it uses all the forms of a democratic society. It is outwardly covered in the garb of legality. You'll have a lawyer, they'll have a lawyer. You'll go before a judge. The judge will look at the charges and ask you how you plead. So outwardly, you're conforming to all your constitutional rights are secure. Except when you step back, you go, no rational person would fight this case because the risk is too high. Let's pivot for a moment to our role as Christians. It turns out that as Christians, we have at our disposal a megaphone. It's called the church. Because if the left has the media, if they have academia, if they have Hollywood, we have these churches across the country, thousands of them. And for some reason, a lot of these churches have persuaded themselves, we have a megaphone, but it should not be used politically. Now, why? Because we have a separation of government and politics. By the way, when I talk about the separation of church and state, kind of reminded of this Catholic priest at Dartmouth. This, I think, was in my freshman year, 1980. He made the comment, he goes, you know, a lot of people are warning me about the danger of mixing religion and politics. And he goes, and I agree with them. And therefore, in the 2 months leading up to the election, he goes, I think I'm going to forget about religion. So, anyway, I'm just reminded of that quip. But the point I want to make here is this. The anxiety about mixing religion and politics is actually quite misplaced. The purpose of having a separation of religion and government is to avoid theological differences to become the basis of political fights. And so, for example, you don't want a politics in which, for example, transubstantiation or what happens to the soul at the moment of death becomes the object of a political struggle. But the founders, while separating theology from politics, never had the intention of separating morality from it. So I think that there is an important distinction to be made between theology, or the sphere of revelation, which is, if you will, out of bounds, and the whole sphere of civic and public morality, which is actually what politics is all about. Politics is all about deciding what kind of society we want to live in. Not just what kind of economic policies we have, but what is the actual fabric and texture of the society we want to live in. Every time I turn on the television, I mean, we have had a biased media before, but this level of hostility to Trump and this level of cover-up for Hillary is unprecedented. I mean, you might even remember the little scene about when Hillary, virtually collapsed into her limousine. Now, think of what would have happened if the only person present when that occurred was a reporter for the New York Times. I can guarantee you that that article would not be in the New York Times the next day. And the same is true of CBS. So it was only because some guy was there with his cell phone. We are now relying on, you may say, freelance journalism of the guy who happened to turn his phone on and happened to record that, and that's how we got the news. So this is actually a very disgraceful sight. We have this whole division of our society, the press, the fourth estate, the people who are supposed to keep a check on the government. And what are they doing? Are they telling us what's going on? No. When I look at the TV, what I see to myself is that by hook or by crook, you've got the media, so many of them. And what they're trying to do is essentially drag this crooked hag across the finish line. That's their job. I think if I were to look at the world and ask myself this question, which worldview, which ideology, which way of thinking about the world is going to triumph in the next 50 years? Who's going to win? You know, when we look at history and we look back, we realize that history has been a record of the winners. We would be living in a completely different society if Germany won World War II. So when we look at the future, we have to ask, who's going to win? And I see only three candidates vying for the title. The first is Islam. Islam is vying to be the winner. Not to say that Islam will run the whole world, but Islam would be the dominant force. That's one. The second is Christianity. Christianity has, of all the religions of the world, the greatest power of conversion. In fact, the Muslims expand mainly through reproduction, big families. The Christians expand more through conversion. The countries in Africa that were 1% Christian 100 years ago, they're 50% Christian now. Christianity has been spreading in Asia, it's spread in South America, and in Africa. So Christianity is a real force. That's the second. And the third is kind of a religion that doesn't go by that name, and that would be modern radical secularism. The whole idea that there is no spiritual horizon, that we are material beings in a material world, and that a secular society in which religion is by and large driven from public spaces of the society. This is the third candidate for the future. Now, it would seem at first glance that the second and the third would unite against the first. In other words, that in America, the radical secularists would say, the radical Muslims are a big threat, let's ally with these Christians to fight that. But this is not the case. We have the peculiarity that the first and the third appear to be allying against the second. In other words, we have a strange bedfellows between Islam on the one side and secular progressivism on the other. How can secular progressivism possibly accommodate Islam? It essentially tries to accommodate it by treating it as just another minority. The Muslims are kind of like the blacks. Let's just import them into the multicultural alliance, and let's just protect them the same way we protect other disadvantaged minorities. Circling back to your question, this phenomenon of radical Islam, I think, is quite unique. I'm not sure if it is the essence of Islam. Some people think it is. The question I raise is, what is it about Islam today that's doing this, that's generating this toxic radicalism? Remember that most Muslims are not terrorists. But in our time and in our world, most terrorists are Muslims. You don't see Buddhist suicide bombers. You don't see other religions doing the things that are going on within Islam. And so this is a peculiar threat of our time. Again, I think as a country we would be more than adequate to deal with it. The problem is that our leadership, in this case Obama, has no interest in carrying on that fight. He has no interest in even doing that. So, and I think with Hillary you're going to see the same thing. So to me, politically, we need to be aware of the problem abroad, but we also are fighting an enemy at home. And that's what makes our political struggle more difficult. We're facing threats on the foreign front, but we're also facing threats on the domestic front.